All right, we're going to begin our class, our first of three classes on George Orwell's novel 1984. And without coming to the conclusion of the course, we'll finish with Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. And interestingly, Huxley and Orwell not only knew each other, but were connected to each other in interesting ways. Huxley was Orwell's tutor, I believe. Let me put here. Let me see here. Just make sure I have got this right. So Orwell was born in 1903, and Aldous Huxley I'm always bad on these sorts of things. Born in 1894. So not much difference in them in terms of age. And the two men we're going to find are very interesting insofar as they both present what we will describe, or is described in literature, as a dystopian view of the future. Now, the term dystopian is neologism. It's a new word, and it's a play on another neologism of the 16th century, utopia. Utopia is a short little book written by Thomas More, which refers to an ideal society. But literally, it's in no place. Utopia, the O, U in Greek, if you're doing any Greek. Is anyone doing first year Greek here? Yeah? No? Okay. Well, hopefully you will. The OU particle is just a negation, so it's a non-place. A topos is a place. And but because of the way in which More frames that early work, we associate utopia with an idealized place, more along the lines of Plato's Republic. So a way we would like things to be, but doesn't yet exist. So that's the vision presented of a utopia that persists to this very day. We think about places that we would like to live in that don't actually exist. Whereas a dystopia is its opposite. It's a place that we would not like to live in. It's a distorted view of reality as we know it. And what we notice in the 20th century, but I think we could already see from what I've said on the course thus far, emerging in the 18th and the 19th centuries, is that the world that has been brought under the tutelage of reason, Cartesian rationality, or the science of Sir Francis Bacon, in which we try and bring nature under our power in order to gain things from it, is increasingly dystopian. It's not just a future reality, it's one that we are presently living in. And both Orwell and Huxley write dystopian novels. Orwell from more the vantage point of an explicit horror scenario. It's a prison state in which you are under constant surveillance, in which Big Brother is watching you. So sort of terms that pass into the English language as recognizable features of human experience that are actually first written about in fiction, but then, as I say, become recognizable as a reality in which we are operating, not just as the world of an imaginative writer. Whereas Huxley, what we'll look at after this, writes very much a futuristic novel that's dystopian, but it's the sort of place where everybody's happy. And their needs are always being met. And they seem not to suffer any torment. And one of the, as I say, Huxley was Orwell's teacher, or I think teacher would be the right word, but of literature. And he said to Orwell, the problem with your fiction here, this horror scenario is that I don't think that it's ever going to come about that it would play out in quite this way. I think people will be seduced into giving up their souls and will willingly surrender part of their humanity, if not the whole of their humanity. That's what the future is going to look like. It'll be absolute conditioning from neonatal conditioning all the way to the grave. There'll be control over that, but you will be willing to go along with that. Where in Orwell's 1984, it's very much the opposite. It's very much of a horror scenario. Now, the context for this, 1984, is this is written in, I think, 1949, in the context of Stalinist Russia. And Orwell was fought on the side of the left in the Spanish Civil War, very much a man of the left, but a sharp critic of his own party, if you will, in particular in the way it was being manifested in Soviet Russia at the time under Stalin. And so we're going to spend 3 classes looking at 1984, and I'll spend, broadly speaking, the first class looking at book 1. There are 3 books, book 1, book 2, book 3. We'll look at book 1 and we'll just sort of take it sequentially, but I'll introduce more of the themes and general ideas here, and then the next 2 I'll pay more close attention to the text. But we're going to be introduced to a protagonist whose name is Winston Smith. And he's a 39-year-old man, probably not that different in age from George Orwell himself. A little bit younger, I guess, but he's a sort of an everyman. He's not a particularly interesting or remarkable figure. But he is a figure who thinks differently than those around him. And we find it when we come into the novel, we're introduced to a state which is already under totalitarian government and under the direct supervision of what is called Big Brother. And Big Brother is presented, by the way, I learned 1984, studied 1984, read it for the first time in 1984, just to give you a sense of how old I am. I did it in high school in 1984, grade 12, 1984. There you go, date myself. And it came out, a movie version of it came out at the same year. And at the time that the novel, that I read the novel and the movie came out, it was under the auspices of the Cold War. For you, that's ancient history. For me, that's the context in which I grew up. Between the Soviet bloc, chiefly under the USSR, and the Americans on the other side, the so-called free world. And for us, it was a sort of a cautionary tale about the horrors of communism and what happens under the police state of the communist regimes. And I'm going to show you a little bit of a picture here. If I can turn this camera on, my fantastic technical skills always coming to the fore. I think it's going to come up. There you go. It did indeed. What you have here is a prison in Cuba. It's called the Presidio Modelo. From the outside, it just looks like a round-shaped building. I think this is used in movies. Various movies have used this as a model of a prison. And what it's built around is a vision of the future created by an English, or associated with an English philosopher by the name of Jeremy Bentham. Does anyone know who Jeremy Bentham is? Heard about him in your philosophy classes? What do we know about? What do you know about Bentham?
He was a utilitarian philosopher.
Utilitarian philosopher. So, if you had to summarize what the utilitarians taught or thought, what would you say?
The greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people is the correct action.
Right. And that view is called utilitarian or sometimes pragmatism. So what the correct policy from the perspective of a government is to pursue the greatest possible good for the greatest number of people, and that will be the rational pursuit, the way forward, if you will. And what we notice of this, which becomes very much a part of English-speaking consciousness and practice furthermore, is that there is an attempt, and we saw it last time when we were looking at Heart of Darkness, a pursuit of efficiency and rationalizing action which is done in the name of the greatest possible good for the greatest number of people, but what it comes at the expense of is the individual. The individual doesn't matter in a Benthamite view of the greatest possible good. It becomes a matter of mathematics. And good policy is no longer the freedom of expression per se, although Bentham is associated very strongly with the defense of free speech, but more the maximalization of pleasure. And he has a pain and pleasure principle as well that's associated with this. But this idea of a panopticon is one of Bentham's ideas, and it gets enacted here in this prison in Cuba, in which you have the word panopticon is an all-seeing. So a vantage point at which everything can be seen all at once. And I think that in many ways it's part of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and the idea of Sauron. It is this perspective that sees through all things. It's always watching you, like Big Brother. And you'll find this rather amusing, I think. This is Jeremy Bentham, or rather, a wax figurine of him at University College London. He left in his will a request that his body be dissected and put in a glass display, and it has been. So that's Jeremy Bentham, University College London, a wax. It's put together with wax, but that's actually him. And they used to have a camera inside of him as well, the Panopticon, which would be, while we were watching this wax statue, looking at it, it was also watching us on a camera and displaying it and so forth. Sorry, it's a little bit grisly, but I think it's kind of amusing myself. But the idea of the panopticon, of being surveilled and under constant surveillance so that the all-seeing state can supervise the greatest possible of good for the greatest number of people, is at the heart of the story of 1984, that sort of power. And it becomes the subject, by the way, of a French philosopher by the name of Michel Foucault. He uses Bentham's idea of the panopticon as the central premise for his work, Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison. I'm not going to talk too much about Foucault here. But the idea of, from the vantage point of rationality, trying to maximize the good of the public by giving the state the authority to supervise human life, that's really the premise behind multiple dystopian fictional works, as far as I'm concerned. And I've already depicted that from the time of, as I say, Jonathan Swift's Modest Proposal onward. You could look at it in terms of Frankenstein, the modern scientist, or as we saw it in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or in Heart of Darkness, this growth of administrative power, pursuing efficiency, gaining power over the earth, but even over human flesh and human nature. So the vantage point of the social sciences, in which people's are analyzed in terms of statistics and measured height, the size of their cranium. Remember back in that in Heart of Darkness, before Marlowe was sent to Africa, his cranium was measured because they expected him to come back in a box. You know, he's not going to come back alive, and they wanted to be able to identify him. And then he said, but the real change will happen inside your head, and we won't be able to measure that. This is a further exploration of the same sorts of themes. And it seems to me that it becomes even more potent in the age of internet surveillance. So your smartphone, which you can communicate with other people on the other side of the planet in a visual form, allows you the power to transcend space and, to some degree, on a minute level, time, because you can do it with somebody in a different time zone. That technological power, however, allows you to see, but on the other hand, are you being seen while you see? And the answer, as we clearly know, is yes. And I would have thought that COVID lockdowns would make that point abundantly clear, because, as you know, we were under surveillance, and your phone has a tracking device, and it's there to see where you are, to offer you local goods and services. But of course, that same technology that can offer you local goods and services can tell exactly where you are. It can pinpoint, and so literally it can watch you. Your device monitors your speech and suggests things on the basis of what you're talking about. They call it passive surveillance. But at what point does passive surveillance shift into something more insidious? And what will stop the people who have the power over the technology from using passive surveillance for a different purpose than the one you intend? What impediment in their definition of human nature will keep them from doing things that you would not want them to do? So we're here at Tyndall at a Christian university, and the understanding that we have of human nature is a legacy of the classical world, but it is really fleshed out in the incarnation. And we say that as Christians, that our identity is found in the person of Jesus Christ, right? Who's God made flesh, the Logos, right? John 1. And at the point that he is an individual person. God in his nature is personal, tripersonal, the Trinity. Jesus is a human person, and we bear the image of God. So we are individuals that bear the image of God. The question is, does that definition of human nature, which is individual human nature, which is really there in the ancient world being defended by the Greeks and the Romans, the individual, the importance of the individual, survive the pragmatism of and utilitarianism of the modern big government approach of Jeremy Bentham? Bentham, by the way, did not want a prison state. He thought this power would be used for good, and wanted it to be used for good. But it, as far as I know, has only ever been effectively used in terms of prison and in terms of mass surveillance. And again, so the question I ask is, what keeps Big Brother from misusing the power that he has on you and on me? What is it that would impede him? It used to be the idea of a common human nature, which we all share. Every person, black or white, male or female, irrespective of nationality, irrespective of station in life, you could be slave, you could be free, would be one in Christ Jesus. Right? Galatians 3:28, right? You're neither this nor that. But all are one. So there's a unity in the person of Christ, whose image we bear, which means that all of the differences of what are today called identity groups are actually, in some sense, inconsequential when it comes to the consideration of human nature. And that includes age of development as well. So the unborn person is still a person, they're just not a fully developed one. But they still are a person, and they have, because of that, they have certain inalienable rights that deserve to be protected. But when you come with the Benthamite proposal of the greatest possible good for the greatest number of people, what happens to the rights of the individual at that point? Is this even a consideration? I think you can see in Bentham's articulation of utilitarianism the same principle that Jonathan Swift described in A Modest Proposal. The proposal is there to feed the poor, give them money, create food, remove the problem of too many Irish Catholics, remove a political threat. The greatest possible good has been proposed by means of his modest proposal. This is the same order of magnitude, but I think it goes one step further in starting to imagine a state in which the power that Swift proposes hypothetically is brought into actualization by a party in power. And we see the consequence of that. Now, one of the things that is striking about this existence as it's depicted here in Orwell's 1984 is that we have a very cold, dark, and empty, and indeed colorless existence. It seems very black and white. The world does not seem to have much color in it. And if you watch the film 1984 at the time, it's largely in black and white. And you'll see a similar use of color in the film Schindler's List. Remember that? I don't know if you've seen that movie. About, again, similar time period, but deliberately cast in black and white. And there's one moment which transforms the perspective of Oskar Schindler in the movie, and that's when he sees a little girl playing in a puddle, and she has a red dress on. And suddenly he sees an individual. And the individuality of a little girl with the red dress, who has color and life and humanity, suddenly shakes him out of what he's been doing and leads him to then backpedal and try and reverse what he has been doing, which is profiting from the dehumanization of others. In 1984, we have no such color landscape. It's just black and white. And there's a sense of alienation that is part of the landscape here. But it's done in the name of the greatest possible good. But in this case, it's not for the greatest number of people. It's for the party in power. And our protagonist, Winston Smith, 39-year-old man, small, thin, works for the government. He works in one of the 4 ministries that serve the government that is called Oceania. And these 4 ministries are rather ironic, and they actually are the inversion of everything they claim to represent by their names. And this demonstrates a particular view of language that Orwell will observe that is characteristic of modern abusive government, which is that they invert the meaning of words. So the 4 ministries are the ministry of truth, which regulates the media in all forms, as well as as well as entertainment and the arts. The ministry of peace, which presides over war. The ministry of love, which is the penitentiary system, the prison system. And the ministry of plenty, which presides over economic affairs. But as we notice in 1984, presides over widespread poverty and growing scarcity of goods. But with those 4 ministries, which sound positive and work negative, Orwell presents his dystopian view of the future. And the reason he can do this is because they control language. It's not only that they control all of life from the perspective of the Panopticon. and they can see all things, and they do see it through something like a flat screen TV in every place. I don't think Orwell imagined the ability to make screens as small as we have and carry them around with you everywhere. Isn't this great? I can access this everywhere. Yes, you can, and you can be watched everywhere you go. The depiction of life is very bleak. So the beginning of the novel describes things that are most obviously dystopian. I wonder if I can find the novel on internet here. Let me see if I can. 1984. Yeah. I don't know if it's up there. Let's see. Yes. Oh, it's even my novel. There you go. Our version. It was a bright, cold day in April. The clocks were striking 13. Winston Smith, his chin nuzzled into his breast in an effort to escape the vile wind, slipped quickly through the glass doors of Victory Mansions, though not quickly enough to prevent a swirl of gritty dust from entering along with him. The hallway smelt of boiled cabbage and old rag mats. So it smells of poverty. They're boiling cabbage because they don't have enough money to buy more substantial food. And there's a musty, dank smell everywhere. At one end of the hallway, a colored poster too large for indoor display had been tacked to the wall. It depicted simply an enormous face, more than a meter wide, the face of a man of about 45. Oop, I thought it was the picture of him there. Of about 45, with a heavy black mustache and ruggedly handsome features, Winston made for the stairs. It was no use trying the lift because the elevator is broken. Even at the best of times, it was seldom working, and at present the electric current was cut off during daylight hours. They're rationing electricity. Everything's being rationed. In 1949, the Britain in which Eric Arthur Blair, George Orwell is writing is rationing goods because Britain has been bombed by the Germans and is in a state of almost crisis. And they have to ration every good. People rarely see something like an orange. An orange gets put in the toe of your stocking. You know, at Christmas when you get an orange there, I don't know if people get that. That's a legacy of wartime Britain. You never get an orange. So if you get an orange there, this is a great prize because you never even seen an orange. So if you have it, it's terrific. Nowadays, you wonder why on earth is this? What's with this silly practice of putting oranges in the toes of our stockings over Christmas? It's from that wartime period. Even at the best times, it was seldom working, and it was part of the economy drive in preparation for Hate Week. The flat was 7 flights up, and Winston, who was 39 and had a varicose ulcer above his right ankle, went slowly, resting several times on the way. So he's 39 years of old, but he's an old man because of poor health. Resting several times on the way, on each landing opposite the lift shaft, the poster with the enormous face gazed from the wall. It was one of those pictures which are so contrived that the eyes follow you about when you move. Big Brother is watching you, the caption beneath it ran. Now, when Orwell wrote this, there were pictures of Lord Kitchener and so forth pointing at you for enlistment. Same thing of Uncle Sam, we want you and so forth. So pictures of a leader pointing at the people that were looking at the portrait in order to serve the country. Orwell probably had this sort of picture in mind here. Inside the flat, a fruity voice was reading out a list of features that had something to do with the production of pig iron used for war. So a strong form of iron. And the voice came from an oblong metal plaque like a dulled mirror which formed part of the surface of the right-hand wall. We would recognize a flat screen in this. Right? Doesn't exist in Orwell's day. Televisions don't really exist like this. If you have a television, you're extremely rich. Here, you're going to find them everywhere. So it is in the future. As I say, it's written in 1949. The future is in 1984. Winston turned a switch, and the voice sank somewhat, though the words were still distinguishable. The instrument, the telescreen it was called, could be dimmed, but there was no way of shutting it off completely. Just like your smartphone. You can turn it off entirely, but it still actually listens to you. All of it's not completely turned off, even when you do turn it off. He moved over the window, a smallish, frail figure, the meagerness of his body merely emphasized by the blue overalls, which were the uniform of the party. Why blue overalls? Working man. Right? We're the brotherhood. Where there's equality here. His hair was very fair, his face naturally sanguine, his skin roughened by coarse soap and blunt razor blades and the cold of the winter that had just ended. But Big Brother is watching you. And we will find that there are little slogans that are there. And all of these are manifestations of the way in which Big Brother is watching you. So these little telescreens are there for you to look at it, but also for it to look at you. And you never know when the Panopticon of the prison guard who's inside the tower is looking at you. You in this prison cell, which is a glass prison wall, you can see here, of the Presidio Modello. You're always being watched. So it's not through a transparent glass wall, it's through the means of a telescreen. And the watch comes upon them there, and it is monitoring not only his words and his actions, but even his facial gestures. And so that poster which said something is matched by the power of the state using technology to make sure that you are conforming to the will of the party. And if you make a wrong gesture, a grimace when you should be smiling and shouting or whatever, you face the possibility of going to the Ministry of Love, which is the prison system. So he is being monitored or governed for the greatest possible good, but now not for the greatest number of people, but rather for the party who's in control of the technology, to make sure that he supports Big Brother at all times and says what Big Brother says reality is. He will have to live and act as if he has no individuality at all. And there are thought police that are around to make sure that everyone is loyal. There's a movie I saw several years ago now. Actually, it was a long time ago, 20 years ago, maybe not, called The Lives of Others. So, and it was about the East German secret police called the Stasi, who, has anyone heard of the Stasi? Probably not. Again, you know that I read 1984. In 1984, I also lived in Germany after the Cold War ended, after the wall came down. And I lived with a fellow who was a trainee surgeon. He grew up behind the Iron Curtain in the city of Leipzig. And I visited Berlin in 1991, I think it was. Might have been 92. And there are still vestiges of the Berlin Wall there. And so I went there and saw the Stasi headquarters. At any rate, the film The Lives of Others is about the way in which the Stasi monitored people. And the chief way that they did it was, well, they would have what they called bugs, so little hidden microphones in your, they didn't have the telescreens, but they had little microphones in there. But the other way in which they did it is they had people informing on one another. So neighbors or even family members turning their fellow family or their neighbors into the secret police. And the reason they did this is because the rumor existed that the secret police were everywhere, and they sometimes were there, 'cause 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 making sure that you were loyal. And so they would put tests in front of you, and to see if you would turn somebody in. If you didn't, you yourself would end up in prison. So as soon as you observed something that was a thought crime or something against the party, you were expected to go forward and hand the people in that you observed doing the wrong thing. And your fears, if you didn't do that, it was actually a test and it was going to be you. So with this means, the Stasi undermined the social resistance to the party, the Communist Party. Same sort of thing that happened under COVID lockdowns, by the way. So people reported on their neighbors, their family, friends. You're not allowed to travel. And it was all for the purposes of keeping everyone safe, etc. Right? But I know people who literally reported on their neighbors and family members who were outraged at other family members breaking the strict conditions that were there to keep everybody safe. So the thought police were there, but actually the thought police were nowhere near as ubiquitous as people thought, and neither were the Stasi, actually. So the Stasi archives, which were opened up while I was still there, I think it was in 1992 or 1993, revealed that the files which the Stasi had on people were largely composed of neighbors and family members testifying against their neighbors and family members. So they didn't actually have that many police, but they had a willing populace. And the willing populace were actually only willing because they were terrified into going along with the dictates of the Communist Party, which they thought was all powerful and always watching them. Every description that we see here in the first few scenes depicts this picture of not only a colorless existence, but a dehumanizing one. So this is part of the dystopian portrait. And there are certain slogans that go with it that show how insidious and how dehumanizing this world is. And they're contained in the irony of the slogans. So one of the slogans is "War is peace." War is peace. Another is "Freedom is slavery." And a third is "Ignorance is strength." These are plastered everywhere alongside "Big Brother is watching you." Now think about those phrases. War is peace. I mean, normally you would say that war and peace are antitheses, right? Even Tolstoy's novel War and Peace suggests two states of human existence, one in which we are fighting, trying to kill our enemies, and the other in which we're but also under the threat of being killed by our enemies, and the other in which that threat has been removed. It's called peacetime, wartime and peacetime. But what happens when you state that war is peace in terms of a definition? Because that's what we have here, war is peace. It's exactly a definition. If you look up the word war in the dictionary and it says peace, you have a definition of an opposite, which is a logical contradiction. If the words mean anything, and that's the point of the definitions, is to demonstrate that words don't mean anything outside of what the party tells you the words mean. So I talked about the four ministries, the ministry of truth, in which Winston Smith works, ministry of love, the ministry of peace, and the ministry of plenty. But the most insidious and powerful way in which Big Brother operates is over the control of speech, of language, and the rewriting of history that goes along with it, and the redefining of definitions. And we'll come in the third lecture on this, so 2 classes from now, to see that one of the things the party could insist is that 2 + 2 = 5. And Winston Smith finds this impossible to accept. You know, you can say 2 + 2 = 5, but that doesn't make it so. So he pushes back with a sort of a defense of common sense. Reality doesn't work that way. You can't say 2 + 2 = 5, or you can say it, but you can't make it so. That's exactly the point of this novel 1984, is to say that the party can absolutely determine and condition all things, including what reality is. And Winston Smith says, there's a difference between your ideology and reality, between your propaganda and the truth. And the state says, no, there is not. There is no difference. Our propaganda is the truth. And we can even change the propaganda. And you will say what we say. And not only will you say it, you'll believe it. You'll be utterly conditioned. So pull back to what we said in looking at in Heart of Darkness about the efficiency and the control of reality, and what Conrad says distinguishes, or at least Marlowe says, distinguishes our present European reality from that of the Romans, is that we have efficiency and we have a commitment to this which goes all the way down. We won't stop. It's an absolute commitment to control and bring under our dominion everything. And it's a national commitment, and it's represented by the colonization of Africa. It's going to be in the name of whoever the king or queen is of that particular country, and that will be a will to power without any moral or ethical boundaries. It's the way of the future. Can you see at least the connection line? Now, the irony of this is that it's done in the name of efficiency, and efficiency is a sort of use of reason. And you've already seen me, remember when I showed the Palace of Versailles and the gardens, and the way in which the gardens were manicured and made in conformity with reason, such that the lines were geometrical, and the trees were the same height, the same shape, etc. The gardens were very carefully geometrically presented. Unlike an English garden where it's sort of apparently not manicured at all. Not true, but it doesn't look like it is in the same way. The irony of that use of reason is that it actually undermines human beings, because it denies a feature of human nature which, again, the church asserts about a human being, which is that we have reason. So let me... This is Boethius's definition of a person. Well, I'll just leave it right there. One of his theological tractates, Boethius, who's a 5th century Christian, got imprisoned, by the way, and wrote a work called The Consolation of Philosophy while in prison. And he is famous for all sorts of things. A treatise on music, among other things, that lasted for about 1,300 years, was used as the main textbook for music. But he gave us a definition of the person. What is that? The individual substance of a rational nature. Human beings have the capacity for reasoning. Animals don't have it. They're also individual substances. There's something physical about it. Remember I talked in Romans 12, 1 and 2. I'll put that back up in case we have forgotten this. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. So having an embodied existence is a spiritual thing. The ancient world saw the mind and the body as not only distinct, but the spirit as being the essence of human nature and the body having nothing to do with it. But Christian theology says that a person has a body, just like Jesus had a body. He took on human flesh. The Logos of God became flesh. But the Logos not only had a physical nature, but a rational nature, which is inherent in the word Logos, the word and reason. So reasoning and speaking are part of the definition of being a person. It doesn't mean that you have to speak to be a human, by the way. So if you're a baby who's not yet capable of speaking, doesn't mean they're not yet a human. They have the potential to do this. An animal does not have the potential to speak. If they did, it's a potential that's never been actualized. No animal has the capacity for articulate, rational discourse. They make noises. They make noises that mean something to them, but it's not rational. They don't understand it. They can't tell stories about it. They don't have a narrative of life. They don't have traditions that they pass on in written form. There isn't a social bond that comes when they get together and tell the stories that unite them. And they don't bear the image of God. Animals don't have that. Whereas in Scripture, it asserts that we do bear the image of God, and we have a body. But furthermore, it says that we are not to be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. So two things there. You're to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, and you're no longer to conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. Now, what we have in 1984 is the use of propaganda to conform our minds to the pattern of this world. And it denies the individual humanity of men and women. So it treats them as if they were not human at all, as if they were an impediment to the greatest possible good, which is now defined not by the majority but by the will of the party politics. And so one of the things that I want you to do when you're on the course, this is first year English, is to think about the ways in which we may unwillingly or unwittingly not be thinking about people and politics and education as Christians, but rather being conformed to the way in which the world thinks about people, which is to see people as groups, identity groups, or the sum total of their identity group characteristics, their intersectionality. Have you heard these words? Question for you. What did Jesus look like? Does anyone know? Sure. He was unattractive on the basis of where you get that from? Do you remember?
I don't remember which verse it is, but I'm assuming.
It's not in the Gospels per se. I might be wrong about this. Is it Isaiah 60, or have I got this wrong? I think I have off the top of my head. There was nothing attractive in him. That passage in Isaiah, it's not Isaiah 60. I can't remember where it is. It might be 61. Sorry? 53. Thank you. That's right. That sounds right. He hath no form nor comeliness, and when we shall see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. He's despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised